Hello everyone, welcome to my very first movie review. Today we're going to be talking about Obsession, the new horror film by Curry Barker. I first heard about this movie back in October when Emma from Spooky Astronauts saw this at Fantastic Fest. I'll link that video below. After that, it was one glowing review after another from the channels I like watching, and by the time March came around, I was counting down days to see this. So I got tickets to see it at an AMC early screening, and yes, if you're wondering if this lived up to the hype, I've seen this movie like 3 times since it's been released. So if you still haven't seen this movie, I'd say absolutely go out and see it, preferably late at night with a decent-sized crowd. It's an almost perfect blend of creeping psychological horror, perfectly telegraphed jump scares, and pitch black comedy wrapped into a twisted love story that plays out nothing like a romance. The plot is simple. A shy guy makes a wish for his crush to love him more than anything in the world, and knowing that this guy is in a horror movie titled Obsession, you can probably guess what happens from there. And it's a properly disturbing and fucked up experience, which is what horror should be, in my opinion. A relatively recent movie I'd compared it to is Talk to Me, which is consistently much bleaker in tone, but is equally mean-spirited and willing to put its characters in horrific circumstances and brutally undeserved endings. I'd hesitate to call this a masterpiece because I do have a few small nitpicks, which I'll touch on later. But overall, this is an excellent film that deserves all the love it's been receiving online. So those are my fully spoiler-free thoughts. I'll be talking about some light spoilers now and some major events towards the end of the video. I watched Curry Barker's previous horror film, Milk and Cereal, on YouTube a few days before Obsession to get a taste of his sensibilities as a filmmaker. And it was a nice little taste of the unnerving modern horror that really comes into fruition during Obsession, with the help of some amazing performances by Indy Navarrete as Nikki. There is a point in this movie, the party scene, where you think, we aren't even at the end of the movie yet. How the hell is she going to top this? And after that point, all semblance of normalcy is stripped away and she continues giving the most unhinged experience I've seen all year. She really manages to embody a character who's had her personal autonomy stripped away to the point that she seems like some kind of yandere robot programmed to kill and destroy anything that gets in the way of her love. And I think that's where the true psychological horror of the story lies. In the fact that she's, of course, not some inherently malevolent entity or monstrous, insane girlfriend. She's just a normal person who's been bent to conform to the will of someone who wants love and will take it by any means necessary. I don't know if it's just my algorithm acting funny, but I've been seeing a decent amount of discourse online regarding whether or not Bear is the villain of the story. I guess this happens when any piece of media goes viral online. The discussion gets a little weird. In my perspective, Bear is very clearly and obviously the villain of the story, despite being the protagonist. But like every well-written character, he's not strictly evil. I think a lesser movie could have easily made Bear a malicious creep from the get-go to hammer home some very blunt social commentary regarding gender dynamics and predatory behavior. And it's not to say blunt stories like that don't work, but I do think it's important that Bear is written to be a sympathetic character, at least initially. I think one of the biggest ideas Obsession is trying to touch on is the fact that seemingly kind, good-natured men who initially lack ill intentions are still capable of predatory behavior, abusing power dynamics to take control of a relationship. Bear doesn't know he's in a horror movie. He makes the wish thinking it's a silly little trinket with no bearing on reality. It's how he consistently fails to consider Nikki as anything more than the object of his affection that makes him the villain. While I do have a few nitpicks about how realistically Gen Z the characters and dialogue are written, this is a case where it really works in the film's favor. And by that I mean Bear is written to be kind of like a guy you know. If you have guy friends, you've met a guy who talks about relationships like he's entitled to one. And if he's ever unhappy in a relationship, it's somehow a fault of the woman around him. You can even see it in social media content related to the movie. It's always, if you aren't playing, pass the ball. But once things get out of control, suddenly she's the insane one. I never wanted this. Bear does all this stuff because he's a man living in a society that tells men it's okay to behave like this. You don't need ill intentions to be capable of hurting someone, and it's even worse if you can't comprehend you're even doing it. That's just my take on some of the more thematic elements of the movie. Now on to the lighter stuff. The music in this movie is incredible. I say see it with the best audio quality possible if you can. My favorite track on the soundtrack is Into Darkness, the one that plays after the party scene and during the end credits. It perfectly captures that wistful, melancholic atmosphere you'd expect out of a story about unrequited young love, before all the head bashes with sharp and or blunt objects. And Current Joys is now in my playlist. I'm mildly embarrassed to say that I've never heard of them before the movie, so yeah. Walking out of the theater on my first watch, the first thing that came into mind was, wow, this music really reminded me of Ethel Cain. I know, Boss Baby meme. I don't listen to a lot of drone ambient, so yeah, my point of reference for that kind of music is Ethel Cain. But I recently saw her post about how much she loved the soundtrack, so I stand by that sentiment. If you like the music and Obsession, check out her EP Perverts. I'd also say the cinematography is also excellent. I'm going to be entirely honest, I'm not a film student. The most exposure to film I've had in an academic setting was a single semester intro to film course. So when I pull out terminology, I'm mostly talking out of my ass. When I hear the word cinematography, I think of mise-en-scene, but I forgot what that means, so I mostly think about colors. And I think the use of color in this movie is excellent. There are so many shots of this movie where Nikki's shrouded in darkness from the neck up. Of course, that plays into the whole being in love with the idea of a person but not the actual person concept. But just visually, it's so cool. I'm not really one to get spooked by obscured figures and odd corners. Usually it gets me excited, like, ooh, I saw that, I'm gonna pay attention to that. But this film serves up plenty of moments that'll reward you for looking at the background for a glimpse of movement. Particularly the odd moment where it looks like they reversed and slowed down footage of Nikki just walking towards Bear menacingly. I said that I usually get excited during these moments because it means things are gonna get serious. It sounds stupid out of context because she did kind of look like Freddy Fazbear in that moment. But when I saw it, it just completely wiped the smile off my face. It was like an immediate lizard brain reaction took over and said, no, you should be concerned right now. In terms of jump scares, there are plenty of loud noise moments that got me jumpy, but weren't trying to do much more than catch you off guard. But the car scene, I'm sure you've heard basically everyone talking about that, but that's what I mean when I say it has a perfectly telegraphed jump scare. Based on the situation alone, you know something bad is going to happen. And just by looking at the way the scene is composed, you know exactly where it'll happen. That empty center space in the window next to Sarah. The anticipation of the scare is bad enough. You're also being served an emotionally resonant moment of dialogue between two characters who've just been having a bad time for the past half hour. Just when you start anticipating the end of the conversation, the shot lingers on Sarah for just a little bit too long, and boom, most shocking scene of the movie ensues. And the jump scare isn't the end of it. You're forced to sit through the whole following action, for lack of a better term. So then you're not sitting there like, oh shit, that just happened. It's, oh shit, it's still going on. Why is it still going? With a nice little absurdly comedic moment at the end to say, the scene is over, but don't you dare think it gets lighter from here. And that's what I mean when I say mean-spirited horror. It takes a lot of commitment to build up a calm, likable character with a few minor flaws, just to hand them the most needlessly nasty end in the whole movie. I've already gone through most of the things I loved, so now it's time for some minor nitpicks. As I mentioned, there are a few points in the movie where the writing felt a little too realistic for how Gen Z young adults talk to each other. I think it's mostly the scenes between Ian and Bear. It's a lot of hooting and hollering to the point where it is realistic, but it's not necessarily the most cinematic feeling. And it did take me a little bit out of the film experience sometimes. It's a really minor nitpick, and it didn't really take me out that much, so I didn't really care. I also would have liked to see Nikki fleshed out a little more. I get that this is a story about Bear, told mostly from his perspective, but Indy Neveretti's performance is so amazing that it left me craving more Nikki. Seeing just a few more glimpses of how the loss of personal autonomy affects the real Nikki, or a few more scenes of a wish Nikki struggling to embody the concept of what Bear wants her to be, could have pushed this into levels of tragedy that would have had me crying by the end. Again, this is mostly a nitpick based on personal taste because I do like a sad tragedy. But if a tearjerker ending isn't really the intention, then that's kind of all besides the point. Even in the ending, I usually prefer a more consistently serious climax, but comedy is so pitch black that I'm satisfied either way. By that I mean Ian's death. I usually don't laugh when I'm uncomfortable, but that was absolutely a scared laugh in the theater. Honestly, I am getting a little bit sick of this movie after seeing it basically everywhere on social media, but I did voluntarily watch it 3 times, so that is my fault. I do think this is the best horror film of the year so far, and I'm gonna be very surprised if some movie manages to dethrone it. Maybe Werewolf by Robert Eggers, but that's gonna come out very, very late in the year. And maybe Can't My Asthma, but I would like to temper my expectations for that one. But watching the movie 3 times, I did pick up a few little small details that I'd missed on the first and second watches. On the second watch, I did accidentally come in late by 20 minutes. That was my fault. But anyways, in the opening first 20 minutes of the movie, Ian does mention that Sarah's dad keeps a gun in the safe. And if you know about the whole Charkov's gun thing, you're expecting that gun to come up later in the movie. And on my first watch, I didn't really put 2 and 2 together. And I'm assuming that the gun that Nikki gets, she finds in the safe. I didn't even notice that in the first watch. I didn't even consider how she got that gun, but it is explained. And I really do appreciate those little minor touches and attention to smaller details. I think those really enhance the movie. And you see it sprinkled all throughout the film, just moments where Nikki is very subtly walking in the background, or the way Ian is written to very subtly show off that he is maybe a little bit jealous of Bear, or maybe a little bit defensive of Nikki because they are having a little side relationship. And there's that scene where Nikki's reciting the odd Hansel and Gretel incest story, which on my first watch, I was not following along with at all. I was just so unnerved by the facial expression she was making and the way her voice just completely flips when she moves from the dialogue to the narration. And I've seen a lot of people online talk about how this whole incest angle is a reflection of the fact that Nikki sees Bear as a younger brother. And while I do think that that's the most plausible theory, I also think that maybe this was originally the book that normal Nikki was talking about at the beginning of the story. Maybe this isn't really the work of a wish Nikki, but it's just been filtered through the perspective of somebody who is now completely obsessive and has these really odd notions about love because they've been twisted through another person's perspective. Because at the beginning of the movie, when Nikki's talking about, oh, this isn't a romance, this is a love story, maybe that's just a really meta take on Nikki's character as a whole, because now she's been twisted through that lens, and now she maybe sees this love story as a romance. And this kind of acts like a microcosm of what Curry Barker was doing with Obsession as a whole, taking this very clearly twisted story to its limit by putting it through the perspective of somebody like Bear, who at the beginning of the movie, he asks, romance and a love story, aren't those two the same things? Conflating this idea and then pushing it to the extreme. And I think that's about it. I hope you guys enjoy my very first review. I don't really know if it's really a review as much as it's just me talking about my thoughts. I recorded this on my iPhone, so if you can't tell, the audio's kind of bad. And let me know if you're looking forward to any other movies you'd like to hear my thoughts on, or any movie that's coming out later this year. This year I've been a little bit disappointed with some of the horror movies. I really like The Bone Temple and Mother Mary, if that counts as a horror movie, but some other things like The Mummy, Undertone, even Alpha by Julia Ducournau, they did disappoint me a little bit. But I heard that Leviticus is pretty good, and Teenage Sex and Death I Can't Miasm Out. They're both queer horror films coming out soon, and I am very excited about those. So you can definitely expect to hear me talk about those a few weeks from now. As always, like and subscribe, and you can also follow me on Letterboxd if you're interested in the kinds of movies I like to watch. I'm new to film, if you can't tell, but it is an interest that I've been trying to work on. So yeah, I'll catch you guys later.